I would like to introduce the mayor of the county of Maui, Alan Arakawa.
Thank you very much.
And Lorraine Akiba, she is a commissioner with the Hawaii Public Utilities Commission.
Aloha.
Aloha. Aloha. And by the way, my mother has lived on the Big Island for 22 years, so I love this state. I am not a local, but I feel like one, so thank you for that. Mahalo. The first question I want to ask is for Kate. You know, I was gratified that horrible day as a journalist when I had to actually report that he's going to do it. He was going to pull us out of the Paris Agreement. And within about, I don't know, 15 minutes, I had information from more than 65 cities that had said, we don't care. We're in. We're staying in. And then by the next Monday, I had other information from about 260 cities. And they were piling on. And many of the press releases and so forth were focusing on not just, obviously, the need to be resilient, the need to care, but the opportunity, the clear opportunity that they had to build on their communities and to build something out of this. So I wanted to ask, you know, obviously local means local things. So how does a community decide, you know, who needs to be at the table to decide where those opportunities lie? How do you get that conversation started?
So it's a great question. I talked mostly about business, but city managers and planners are really the business people of cities, right? And mayors to a great extent. And cities really have led the charge here because it's an imperative. What I think has been gratifying over the last few years is that economic development folks are getting, and managers are getting involved in this conversation. It's not relegated to a sustainability conversation. It's a long-term planning, infrastructure, how do we plan? And there's a couple places that are doing amazing things, and you all know more of them. I was in Kauai yesterday, and they have very expensive energy, as does the state of Hawaii generally, but also have brought together education, economic development, workforce development, and their sustainability folks around long-term planning that will make them more resilient and get them to 100% renewables, which of course the state has set a goal. You see this in New York City post-Sandy. Sandy was the imperative that led to New York really planning differently. They've completely changed their flood mapping, and their zoning codes reflect it. And to me, that's the sign that a city is really walking the walk.
Right.
That those operational decisions, just like with companies, you know, are you changing your supply chain? Are you changing your investments? With cities, are you changing your zoning codes? Are you changing the way you do planning to take all this into account and really do that kind of real forward thinking?
You mentioned a couple of examples, and you also mentioned examples of how profoundly local this is in Las Vegas, Phoenix, and it's different everywhere. Are there commonalities, though, common themes that you need to address from an economic standpoint?
Yeah, I mean, there's there's a commonality, I think, in that many places don't start this until there's a crisis, which is too bad.
Got it.
But it's the way human nature is, I think. But then there's common, you know, two kind of paths. There's a common theme of looking at existing infrastructure and assets and trying to make sure that they will work for the long-term health of the place. And then there's a common theme of, you know, at the best places, what are our assets? What does our workforce look like? What do we bring to the table? And how can we leverage that to create opportunities, not just within our communities, but also for export, for innovation, for really leading the way. And I think that's been exciting to see this leadership kind of framework evolve, not just reaction and resignation, but really this leadership moment.
You're nodding.
Yeah, I want to comment off of what Kate said, and I think it is true. You know, a lot of this comes out of a crisis mode, but I think it was Eleanor Roosevelt that said, in every crisis arises an opportunity, and I really do believe that, and I think that one key stakeholder or one key partner in all this that we the speakers previous and we've yet to acknowledge are the local community members, the customers, the prosumers that we all know in Hawaii at least, because they're quite enabled and quite empowered and educated about what choices are, And so I think it is a real locally driven, and thank God we don't have a national energy policy given the rhetoric and the fake news coming out of DC. But you know, state policies are continuing to move forward, and they're driven by cities and community inputs. And I think to add to what you said, Heather, I mean, you know, since the last count, I think 180 mayors have, you know, committed to a very high renewable portfolio standard.
Right.
I'm going to shout out to Commissioner Carla Peterman from California, because there are several California cities that after the announcement was made to withdraw from the Paris Agreement, like Hawaii, joined and said they're committed at the local level to do 100% renewable portfolio standards by 2030. So it is not just, you know, I think it's everybody realizing what impacts you locally. You can act globally, but you have to act locally. You can think globally, but you have to act locally. And the impacts are most felt in cities and in communities that are realizing daily the impacts of climate change.
Yeah. So Mayor Arakawa, how did this change, you know, how did the renewable portfolio standard change your economic imperatives in the county of Maui? And by the way, your county consists of several very diverse areas, right? There's very different needs for.
We have 4 islands.
Yep.
Maui, Molokai, Lanai, and Kaho'olawe. But let me suggest that all of the action that's happening right now is not new.
Right.
The different accords that are being presented, we signed on to it early on. For over 20 years now, we've had studies explaining that there's sea level rise. Chip Fletcher from the University of Hawaii did some studies. The University of Hawaii is currently going through and presenting to each of the communities what's going to happen as the sea level rises. So we've had decades to be able to start preparing for a lot of what we need to be preparing for. And some of us have taken advantage of it. On Maui, we've tried to acquire as much of the beach areas on our north and south shores, which is our populated areas, so that we don't have houses falling into the ocean, so that we can have setbacks from the ocean. We've put into law requirements for setbacks on the coastlines. We've known that there are changes that are occurring environmentally that we needed to be able to address. So we've been looking at the alternative energies. 3-4 years ago, when we first started talking about going to alternative energies, everybody thought we were crazy when we started saying we need to go to 100% alternative energy. 2 years after that, we've got a state mandate going to alternative energies. But the technology cannot be looked at just locally. We're following a lot of the technological change that are happening globally. And if you look at many countries that are having to address this, I was invited to go to Hangzhou in China to speak. And when I went there, you know, you're looking at people that are having to wear respirators because the smog is so thick, you can almost, I mean, you can't breathe. So the Chinese government literally had to change their position, asking for help. And they were there criticizing and critiquing what they were doing, which I thought was really unusual, you know, after all reading about government protecting itself.
So you were already working on this. I mean, this is just a fact. It doesn't matter. The state level mandate doesn't help you. I mean, does it help you? I mean,
we've been doing this for a long time.
So how does it bring in more investments? How does it amplify or enhance what you're doing?
Let me suggest that every change is an economic opportunity. Every time we shift from one product to another product, somebody has an opportunity to be able to take advantage of that situation. Mm-hmm. When we start looking at land use, if we sit back from the ocean, the property right behind that becomes more valuable. If we start putting in better infrastructure, roads, sewer systems, we prepare, there's profits to be made from every aspect of doing the engineering work, to doing the construction work, to actually putting new value to properties. When we start looking at developing the technologies for alternative energies, every alternative energy company has the opportunity to be able to expand their business. And indeed, you're seeing many of the alternative energy companies that are economic-wise almost as big as the utilities or major electric companies. Why? Because those are business opportunities. So every time we see a need and a change in technology, you're always going to have the status quo trying to protect the old technology because that's where they're vested. Whereas you're going to have a lot of the new companies coming in and going, well, give us a chance to make the improvements because it's going to be better for the community, better for the world in the long run. And we've got to be able to allow this evolution. It's important.
No, I think that's right. I also think it's worth remembering that, again, for every place, it's a different set of drivers. Mm-hmm. So in China, as you just mentioned, Mayor, air quality has been a huge driver. So has the overall national commitment to moving from an industrial economy to a service-based economy. That means a lot of manufacturing is going to other countries and lowering the carbon footprint. It's a twofer, basically.
Right.
In Hawaii and in Alaska, where I've done a fair amount of work, energy costs are high. People are burning diesel, right, for electricity. The economics are different, and so I absolutely believe that there's been an imperative for a long time to become, this is an island, to become more independent, to become more reliant on local sources, on renewable sources, and to bring down those costs, right? In other places, the risk argument really is a better argument because you've already got really low energy costs and you don't have that kind of dependence, and you have an economy that's fairly energy intensive. And in those places, it's a different set of arguments, right? So it goes back to me, this is sort of economic development 101. You've got to start with where people actually are. What are the assets? What are the opportunities? What's the geography? What's the climate? And then really build up from that instead of sort of thinking that there is an answer that will work for every jurisdiction.
Well, there's one more criteria I think that you really have to look at. You can't look at the status quo and say that's our base. You have to look at the projection into the future and what the goal of the community needs to be and how you're going to be able to achieve the goals of the community, not just the businesses that exist.
Yeah, if I can chime in here, I think there's various factors and drivers of change. I mean, going back to your original question, Heather, no doubt about it, the 100% renewable portfolio standard now is a major driver of change. I mean, it's an external driver, not that that wasn't happening internally, as Mayor has pointed out, because of the commitment, I think, as many of the speakers, and I think Tom started us out. We come from a native coast culture, thanks to the Native Hawaiians. We've had a culture based in sustainability, stewardship of the resources. They were the most sustainable, communities before, Western contact. We know that the Polynesian wayfinders, have charted the course and have to be visionary because you're looking at the stars to navigate. It takes courage, it takes leadership, but it's also being able to be visionary, imagining where you're going by looking at the stars. And that analogy is here too. We deal with the reality of today and the status quo, but the opportunity here, as I've always said, when I go nationally and internationally to travel and I see other partners internationally, what we're doing here is very important. Not only are we a living laboratory, not only do we face more issues on a concentrated basis because we're all island grids, not connected. An energy ecosystem in an island it's much more limited. We don't have an energy imbalance market that we can sell excess renewable energy out beyond the state or island borders. So solutions must be created and implemented within the island, but there is the crucible of innovation, and I think as Aki preceded us, we talk about many of the innovation companies that actually have gotten their start here in Hawaii from our own accelerator because of the necessity to make those changes, and out of that, a lot of creative solutions and technology, and I do think we are seeing the clash between the new world clean energy and technology economy and an old world economy. We're seeing that play out right now in DC, and we've seen that playing out globally. But when I go on my travels around the world and nationally, I do talk with people. There are international partners, and Hawaii has been at the forefront of working with partners from Okinawa, Japan, Europe, most recently from Europe. And these countries have committed to the Paris Agreement, and they've committed to decarbonization. And there is economic opportunity for us here in Hawaii, not only to demonstrate, but to help support and fund those innovation companies that have technology solutions that enable even more integration of renewables.
So businesses like the status quo for one reason, people like the status quo for an important other reason, which is it's their livelihood, it's their job. People hold on to the status quo because it's what they know, it's where they make it's how they live. Yep. So how...
And it's cultural.
And it's cultural.
I totally agree with the cultural.
I got it. But so how do you get
yeah.
people to the new place?
At the same
locally?
time.
How do you help them see that?
At the same time, anyone that has children right now knows that the technology the children are using in school, the little iPhones, the little iPads, all the little tools, are changing the world dramatically And every month you turn around, there's a different app for it. Public right now is at a point where they recognize that things are not going to be the status quo. Every job is going to change. The very caricature of what we consider stable in our community, we all drive cars. We may not be the drivers pretty soon because we may have autonomous vehicles. We all like to be able to control all the food and everything that we eat. With all the combinations of all the diseases and all the insects and everything else throughout the world, we have to be able to look at the new technologies to be able to keep our food supply going. Just last week, we were in Washington, D.C., and we were talking about the ocean. By 2050, they're expecting that there'll be more plastic in the ocean by weight than fish. And they're looking at how are we going to be able to sustain our livelihood when most countries depend on seafood. How are we going to be able to change what we do to make this new environment that we've created into a better environment? We have to be able to be the leaders and set the standards, the goals that we want to be able to see 50, 100, 500 years from now, start the program and the planning to be able to direct us in the right direction. Because if we just deal with the status quo and say, well, we're comfortable, we're not going to be comfortable when the status quo overwhelms us and we can't survive in our own communities.
Elaine, I'd love to take a question from the sidebar. What have you?
Yeah, so one of the questions that we sort of were mulling around was, given the level of expertise on the panel right now, we want to understand more about how regulatory policy comes into play here. So from a policy standpoint, how can regulatory policies help businesses and communities better connect the dots? So right now you're talking about climate change, infrastructure investments, clean energy, et cetera. But from a policy standpoint, a lot of the times those things are disconnected. So what do you think would be a good strategy? Do you hold up certain kinds of other locations that have done it effectively? Who do you look toward to emulate a more connected policy structure?
Let me handle that initially because it's politically loaded. Quite frankly, we have gotten to the point where we're over-regulating. We've got away from basic logic, and we've forgotten that we should be creating rules that have a basis for what we're doing. And we've become very bureaucratic and saying, hey, we got a rule, we got to be able to follow the rule, we got to go to the nth degree, no matter what it was meant for, it's there, who cares? We've got to get back to making the world sustainable and livable, and you can't do it by over-regulating and creating the circumstances where housing in Hawaii becomes $700,000 per plus for a median income house, and the average income can't pay for half of that house. Mm-hmm. So we've got to be able to find ways to now get ourselves out of our own way to be able to progress in a logical manner because we've gotten away from common sense.
Well, as the regulator on the panel, let me respond. I don't necessarily agree, at least in the energy sector, that there is overregulation. I think there's been a history of why we regulate utilities, public utilities, especially if it's a monopoly utility. There is a social contract to that in terms of service to all. But I think how the regulatory policy and the framework can assist is that we need to be able to adapt and change the regulatory model as well to keep up with the types of innovations and technology and the grid edge development and the grid modernization demands and the challenges, and to look at ways that we incent that for utilities so that they don't stay with the status quo, to be able to get cost recovery for that. And I think in our jurisdiction that we issued in 2014 on the Hawaii's Utilities of the Future, we need to facilitate that so that financial markets understand, even if you're an economic regulator, financial markets and analysts understand the value of innovative technologies, and even if it's not CapEx in terms of a transmission line, CapEx in terms of a substation, transformer, or hard widgets, that there are other values in this new clean energy economy. And I'd say we're in the digital economy. You see that, just go outside and see all the different companies and all the different, even the traditional companies that are becoming more enabled with control systems, and the grid is much more complex. We have to integrate it with other sectors, transportation, et cetera. And in order to achieve smart cities and a sustainability that we have all envisioned, we do need to have a flexible regulatory model, but we do need to have regulation in the sense that we can level the playing field so that there is competition, so that we can have the best rise and the best ideas come forward, and we work in partnership. And I have to give a shout out to our local utilities who have tried to do that, in terms of working with others, independent power producers, folks at the, demand response aggregation. Those are areas where we partner. We try to include other partners in the energy ecosystem, and the regulatory model has to accommodate that shift and that change so that we are now looking to the virtual economy. We're talking about artificial intelligence, sensors. These are all the new developments.
I want to interject in this, Lorraine. There are rules that we need to be able to have in place to make it fair. But then there are a lot of rules that we have in place that make it much more difficult to evolve as we need to. Let's take the wheeling rule, for instance. In a community now, the way the rules were, each individual house has to do a study and has to go through all this preparation to be able to be accepted onto the grid. If an entire community could build a photovoltaic system or an alternative energy system and share it within itself, it would make it much more sustainable and much easier for everybody to be able to work with it. But
I agree. That's why you have to look at our community-based renewable tariff.
And I think this is a great example of how the conversation needs to continue within a community.
Yeah.
And I think the community pointing
Community
back to
solar
utility
mayor.
putting pressure on.
I've been following the legislation, but the fact is we're moving much slower than we should be because we have this massive regulations, and we're trying to be
I disagree. I don't think we're moving slower because of the massive regulation.
We're
It's
going
the
to get yanked
dialogue.
off the stage, but this is a great place to leave it because
Stakeholder input takes a long
basically,
time.
I've been
Here's the deal.
working on this for years.
local
now.
opportunity,
Democracy.
local conversations, and local arguments. Please thank our panel. They've been terrific. I hope they've all got you thinking. Kate Gordon, Mayor Arakawa, and I keep butchering his name. I did not do that on camera earlier. And Lorraine Akiba. Thank you very much to our
Thank you,
panel.
Heather.
Thank you very much.